Hello, so we're going to have another worksheet for this. The distance formula worksheet, numbers 1 through 11 are your homework and 12 is the presentation problem. If you can print it, that's great. If not, just do it in your homework notebook like you normally would. So for the distance formula, what is this for? This will help us find the distance between 2 points. So, for example, if you're thinking about some of the problems that we had last week when we were together before Thanksgiving break, is when you had a triangle or a trapezoid, you couldn't find its perimeter because there was a slanted line and you couldn't count over how many spaces there were. However, now you'll be able to find the perimeter of any of those triangles, trapezoids, parallelograms, because you're going to be able to find the distance between 2 points. Now, there's 2 different ways that you can do this. The first one is going to be just like slope, where you're going to say, all right, well, we can draw a graph and draw in the rise and run. Now, one thing I do say about this method is that a lot of times students will not read carefully and they will either do slope or they will do the distance formula. And you want to make sure that you're reading. So in this case, it says distance. So we want our answer to be a decimal because we're going to do a square root. And if it's slope, your answer should be a fraction. So that's sometimes helpful to think about. So when we're doing a graph, we want to find the distance here between the 2 points. So if we draw in our rise and run, so here's, in this case, my rise is negative, and then my run. I can then form a right triangle here, and I can use the Pythagorean theorem to find the distance here, which would be c. There is also a formula just like slope, and when we don't have the picture, we can go over the formula. So if I'm looking here, my rise would be negative 1, 2, 3, 4. So my rise is negative 4, and my run is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So my run is positive 8, since this is the positive direction, and then this is negative. Now we're going to use the Pythagorean theorem. So we'll start with a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Our a and b are our rise and run. So in this case, negative 4 squared plus 8 squared is equal to whatever that distance is squared. I'm going to use d for distance. And now we can simplify. Negative 4 times negative 4 is positive 16. So make sure that you're dealing with your negatives correctly. As we talk about with distance, is always positive. So if you end up with a negative here, you know you've done something weird. Is equal to d squared. 16 plus 64 is 80. I will then, since that isn't one of our nice perfect squares, I will get out my calculator, put a square root, and I will end up with the distance between these points is 8.9. Again, if you want to add units, you absolutely can. So that's how you solve for the distance when it's already graphed. You just draw in the right triangle and use the Pythagorean theorem. Now sometimes it will just give you the points like this. Now you can go find your graph paper, you can graph it yourself, hope you don't make it an error, or you can use the formula. Now as we looked up there, the formula is rise squared plus run squared, just like we used here. Now if you remember from the formula for slope, the rise is the difference in the y values, and the run is the difference in the x values squared from the Pythagorean theorem. And then to get d by itself, you just take a square root. This is definitely one of the more complicated formulas that you will be using in this class, and so you can absolutely make sure you have your notes and everything out and available to you when you're taking quiz, when you're doing the check-ins, when you're doing the notes, because you are allowed that. So the first thing I'm going to do if I'm going to use this formula is I'm going to define what each of these variables are. So negative 3 is my first x value, and 4 is my second x value. 6 is my first y value, and negative 2 is my second y value. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use those in the formula that we're given here. So the difference in the y values squared plus the difference in the x values squared all inside the square root. So in this case, the distance is equal to the square root. I will plug in my numbers. -2 minus 6. And then my x values, 4 minus -3. Make sure you're keeping the negatives. You notice how this has a negative right here. Subtraction plus the negative on the 3. Squared, all inside the square root. From there, you're going to want to follow your order of operations, which means that you're going to do the parentheses first. Remember our order of operations, PEMDAS. Parentheses first. So in this case, that's -8 squared plus, and then this is 4 plus 3 if you want to write it out to simplify those negatives. I strongly encourage that. So then we have 64, remember we're expecting positives, plus 7 squared, which would be 49, which we can add together inside of the square root to 113. So now that we've simplified what's inside the square root, we want to type that into our calculator, and we end up with 10.6 rounded to the nearest tenth. If you have questions about the distance formula and you get stuck on any of the things in the homework, please remember to use the nomination forms that are attached, or you can set up a Zoom meeting, leave me a comment, or send me an email.